Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ernest Becker Foundation webinar. The Ernest Becker Foundation examines the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors, both on an individual and societal level. Today, researchers will give 5-minute presentations demonstrating the diversity and creativity of current research in terror management theory, the field of research derived from Ernest Becker's work. My name is Peter Helm, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Montana State University, and also on the board of the Ernest Becker Foundation. I research terror management theory, as well as other existential motivations more broadly. For those unfamiliar, terror management theory, or TMT, examines the ways in which humans cope with their mortality. You don't need to be a TMT expert to understand today's presentations, but for those who would like to dive deeper, you can learn more about TMT at ernestbecker.org/resources. I will introduce each panelist prior to their presentation. After all the presentations, there'll be time for Q&A, so feel free to write down your questions so you don't forget, and we will address them as best as possible in the order received. You can submit questions via the live chat to the right of your screen. Panelists, just as a reminder that you are also welcome to pose questions for each other as well. With that, let's get started. First up, we have Dylan Horner, a PhD candidate in social psychology at the University of Arizona. Take it away, Dylan.
Awesome, thank you, Peter. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And so thank you for that introduction. My name is Dylan. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Arizona. And a lot of my recent work has focused on existential concerns among transgender people and the role of autonomy support for gender expression. And so transgender or trans is a term used to describe people whose gender identity does not align with the culturally bound gender typically associated with their sex at birth. For instance, an individual may have been born and assigned female at birth, but then later in life identify as male. And research has found that trans people face high rates of gender-based discrimination and harassment in various domains of life that are important to their sense of value and self-esteem. Moreover, these discrimination and harassment experiences often contribute to their experience of trauma. And trans people also report high rates of feeling misunderstood and needing to educate others about their experiences. And so these issues might be important for a number of reasons. One particular reason, and one way we might think about these issues, is that they're likely to lead trans people to feel heightened levels of existential concern. For instance, discrimination and harassment might hinder their ability to feel a sense of personal value. And as previous research has found, when people's sense of personal value is threatened, this can lead to things like high levels of death-related thought. Moreover, trauma has been found to basically shatter the protective function of people's worldview. So the systems of meaning and the people that they rely on may no longer provide this protective function. As a result, they might feel high post-traumatic stress and low perceptions of meaning in life. And finally, this experience of having to explain their experiences and feeling misunderstood by others seems likely to lead trans people to feel a sense of being alone in their subjective experience. And so they might also be prone to feeling greater feelings of existential isolation. And so this research in part was focused on addressing whether or not trans people are indeed experiencing these existential concerns, but also it was focused on identifying a resource to help them manage and deal with these issues. In particular, this research was focused on something called autonomy support for gender expression. In other words, feeling that one's personal control of and self-authorship for their gender identity and expression is supported by others. So an individual who feels a high sense of autonomy support for gender expression might agree with the statement, when I'm around people who are important to me, I feel a sense of choice and freedom in my gender expression. They might also agree with the statement, when I'm around people in society, I feel encouraged to express my true self in my gender expression. And so in this study, which was conducted online, we recruited participants, 429 participants, and of that, 294 were cisgender and 135 were transgender. Cisgender referring to individuals whose gender identity does align with their gender assigned at birth. And so this study allowed us to do two things. First, it allowed us to compare cisgender and transgender people's levels of existential concerns. So we had a variety of ways to measure death-related thought, post-traumatic stress, perceptions of meaning in life, and feelings of existential isolation. But then we also tested if trans people who felt more autonomy compared to those who felt less autonomy support would report better outcomes on these indicators of existential concern. And what this study found was that compared to cisgender people, trans participants reported greater levels of existential concern. In particular, they reported higher levels of death-related thought, higher levels of post-traumatic stress, lower perceptions of meaning in life, and greater feelings of existential isolation. But importantly, those who felt a sense of autonomy support from others compared to those who didn't quite feel that type of support reported better outcomes, particularly higher perceptions of meaning in life and lower feelings of existential isolation. And so although trans people might be experiencing these heightened levels of existential concern, supporting them through their autonomous and volitional self-expression may be a potential resource for helping mitigate these issues. And so my ongoing and current work is further exploring these ideas. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank the Ernest Becker Foundation, and then also thank my co-authors, Jeff Greenberg and Alex Deloff.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dylan. That's very interesting work. To the audience, remember to write down your questions you have for the Q&A. But next up, we have Katie Engel, an undergraduate student and a member of the Terror Management Lab at James Madison University.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katie, and today I will be going over sleep troubles, death thought accessibility, and its impact on sleep quantity and quality. The purpose of the present study is to examine the amount and quality of one's own sleep and how it impacts their levels of death thought accessibility. We had a 2x2x2 design. We were looking at inducing mortality salience versus not, doing sleep time, high versus low, and then fantastic life, high or low. And for those who might not know, fantastic life is a scale used to see how well people feel their own life is. And they're asked questions such as, I exercise daily, I don't smoke, I don't drink, things like that on the scale. And it kind of sees how their perceived wellness is in their own life. So these were our pre-registered hypotheses. The first three looked at mortality salience and sleep time and its impact on death thought accessibility, death anxiety, and existential isolation. Next, our next two hypotheses were mortality salience and fantastic life, and they looked at how that impacted death anxiety and death thought accessibility. These were our demographics, and they were pretty representative of the school where we sampled from, which is majority female. So we saw majority of females with 107, 22 males with a mean age of 18 years old because we did sample many freshmen. There was an average sleep time of 7.5 hours per day and an average PSQI score of 6.64. And for those who may not be familiar with PSQI scores, the higher the PSQI score, the lower someone's sleep quality is. So it can be a little confusing to look at sometimes. But for reference, knowing about this kind of average PSQI score, anything that not higher than a 5 is suggested to go to a sleep specialist. So you can see, that was the mean there. Our manipulation check went well, looked at mortality salience and if it was having the impact. And these were our results. So each of our hypotheses were not significant. However, the correlations could be implicated for future research, and their directions were pretty interesting. So these were our non-significant correlation directions. I won't go through all of them, but I'll just highlight a couple of them that were points of interest for us. So we saw that as individuals' sleep time went up, so did their existential isolation. So perhaps people sleeping more had some impact on their cognitive abilities, being able to think about that. But we also found that as their PSQI scores were going up, so their sleep quality was getting worse, their existential isolation scores were also going up. Another interesting finding was hypothesis 4 and 5, where fantastic life scores were going up, so was death anxiety. And then for hypothesis 5, as fantastic life went up, death thought accessibility went down. Something that was not a pre-registered hypothesis, but something that we found was the morning-evening scale. So individuals who were applied with the mortality salience condition, they had lower levels of death thought accessibility if they were a morning person rather than an evening person, perhaps suggesting that there might be, being a morning person yourself might be a buffer in itself to your death thought accessibility rather than an evening person. And for those who might not be familiar, morning versus evening person is kind of thinking about morning just as you would think I'm a morning person or I'm an evening person, how people function and like better in those times of day. So the implications are, we look back at kind of those existential isolation scores, and maybe individuals who have more time sleeping might have more time to do conscious pondering of the person's own existence and the realization that every person is essentially alone. However, on the other hand, poor sleepers have increased levels of cortisol. So cortisol tends to spike with people who have poor sleep quality. So that could just be a level of anxiety and stress and not due to existential isolation, death anxiety, or DTA. So for future research, it might be interesting to do measurements on those levels, those biological things, to see where all of that is coming through. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Next up, we have Peter Montwell, who's actually from the same lab as Katie. He is a second-year graduate student at James Madison University. It's all you, Peter.
All right, thank you. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Peter Montwell. I'm from James Madison University, and I wanted to explore if there's any effects of a theory called framing on terror management theory and how people think about their own death. So to start, I just want to do a little background. So many have probably witnessed the news as a polarized medium with contrasting channels such as Fox News and CNN presenting various issues through a multitude of lenses, each representing the channel's own personal worldview. This presentation of reality is called Framing, and it attempts to explain how different issues are presented and what aspects are made known to the public. So as I just mentioned with the examples of Fox News and CNN, these frames can create these worldview-specific channels, which viewers will choose to watch depending on if it matches with their own personal views. For my study, I focused on the use of two specific frames, episodic and thematic framing, which are most used in political media. Episodic frames report issues in terms of personal individual stories to generate emotional responses, while thematic frames report the news in regards to general statistics and trends of an issue. Terror management and its impact on the news has some research on it, displaying that news stories have been seen to trigger thoughts about death, but not much has been done on the impact of episodic and thematic frames. So the purpose of this study is to see if episodic and thematic framing had any effects on thoughts about death or levels of agreement towards crafted Instagram posts. When conducting the study, there was a large sample with around 487 participants, mostly consisting of women, reflecting the gender distribution present at JMU. There's also a larger portion of Democrats among the sample, although distribution of affiliation remained more equal for the group. For my materials, there was two sets of crafted posts that were titled MS Controversial and MS Non-Controversial. The MS represented that the posts were designed to induce thoughts about one's own death, and there was an episodic and thematic version of each topic, so 4 posts total. The controversial topic on the right discussed the pro-life movement, and the non-controversial topic on the left discussed the dangers of national parks. Instagram posts were chosen as the experimental news medium due to surveys indicating that college students tended to use social media for their main news consumption, which was also true for this study, as the most popular news medium reported was social media, and the most popular social media platform used for news was Instagram. So to measure death thoughts, a traditionally used word stem task was utilized, where ambiguous stems are either filled with a general word or death-related word, while to measure level of agreement, a traditionally used attitudes questionnaire was altered to measure attitudes towards an Instagram post author. This altered questionnaire showed high reliability and can be seen on the right-hand side of the slide. So there are five hypotheses to measure death thoughts, which were included to predict that death thoughts would be higher for people viewing the MS controversial posts across all conditions, especially for women and Democrats. The episodic frame of this post was also predicted to produce higher rates of death thoughts, especially when presented with the MS controversial post. However, these results did not show what I expected. The amount of death thoughts present was not found to be significantly different between any of the conditions. And in fact, it was actually the non-controversial post that had the highest level of death thoughts across all conditions. Some reasons why this may be is that reading about parks may ignite thoughts about people thinking about themselves in terms of own animals, which in other literature has been shown to increase death thoughts more than any other kind of induction. I crafted also five more hypotheses to test level of agreement, and these were pretty similar towards the death thought hypotheses, essentially stating the same thing, that there would be less agreement with the author for participants that viewed the MS controversial posts, especially among those who were women or Democrats. And then additionally, the episodic frame post would result in the greatest amount of difference between the conditions. And on these results, I actually did find some significant mean differences, as the MS controversial group exhibited lower levels of agreement towards the post author. There's also significant differences between the political affiliation and gender on level of agreement, as those that identified as Democrats and female exhibited lower levels of agreement towards the controversial post author compared to other groups. This fits in with literature surrounding worldview agreement and defense, as Democrats and females are groups that are likely not to have the pro-life viewpoint as a part of their worldview, leading to greater disagreement with a pro-life author. There were, however, no differences found between the episodic and thematic frames between the posts, leading to the belief that the text of the post may not have impacted the differences found, but rather it was just the topics themselves. So the next graphs kind of display this relationship between level of agreement and political affiliation and gender. This first graph shows that Democrats were significantly less agreeable with the pro-life story than other affiliations, while the next graph shows that women were especially not agreeable with the pro-life condition as compared to males and the other MS non-controversial. So in conclusion, there was found to be greater levels of disagreement among participants presented the MS controversial posts, especially among females and Democrats. There's no difference seen in the type of frame used and between any of the conditions on levels of death thought. So due to these results, there's future plans for this research to have a follow-up analysis run where a true control condition will be included that will hopefully shed insight into whether the current results are simply due to the topic choice, or if the induced thoughts of death and differences of agreement are a result of what the text was framed in regards to talking about death. And so with that, thank you all for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Peter. Now we're going to hear from Marcus Chur, a graduate student in the Clinical Psychology Master's Program at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Marcus, and my presentation today is a life examine, the effects of death awareness on authenticity. So a little bit of background. TMT posits that awareness of one's own death motivates people to cling on to their cultural beliefs and values. We gain self-esteem when we believe we're living up to these beliefs and values. Authenticity refers to being true to oneself. And in Western culture, we place a high value on being authentic. So being authentic is a good way of gaining self-esteem. And thus we believe that being aware of our own death will motivate people to see themselves as more authentic and also strive to be even more authentic. So this was an exploratory study looking at the relationship between death awareness and authenticity. And we wanted to look at 6 variables to see how they would factor into this relationship. So the 6 variables were existential isolation, which is being alone in one's subjective experience, basic psychological needs, which is BPN. So having your BPN met would lead to greater psychological well-being, autonomy, where one's behavior is congruent with their sense of self and values, self-esteem. So person's attitudes and evaluations of themselves, narcissism, a pattern which is defined as a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. and psychological reactance, the behavior to restore freedom when it feels threatened or restricted. So the demographics for the study, we ran it on prolific.co, which is online, and we had 300 adults with an average age of about 43 years old, and the gender distribution was roughly 50-50. So for the study materials, we had the 6 variables as pre-measures: existential isolation, BPN, autonomy, self-esteem, narcissism, and psychological reactance. And then for the death awareness manipulation, we had half of the participants in the experimental condition who were asked to describe the emotions that the thought of their death arouses in them, and also write what they think will happen as they die, and once they're actually dead. And then in the control condition, it was the same thing, except they would be writing about dental pain. The authenticity measures, so we measured authenticity of the self and of others. So in the self, an example question would be, I'm true to myself in most situations. And then of others, it'd be most other people are true to themselves in most situations. And then the authenticity striving scale, which is I look forward to pursuing my authentic self. So our results / findings, we found that people who are more existentially isolated, more autonomous, had more of their BPN met, and or had greater self-esteem, tended to view themselves as more authentic. However, those with more of their BPN met saw others as more authentic. Instead, people who are more existentially isolated and or more narcissistic were more likely to view others as less authentic. We also found people who were more autonomous, had more of their basic psychological needs met, and or had higher self-esteem were more likely to want to live more authentically. So in conclusion, mainly having your BPN met and or being autonomous tends to lead you to view yourself and others as being more authentic, and also wanting to strive to be even more authentic. So it kind of shows like they tend to have more of a trusting and positive view of the world. And on the flip side, those who are more existentially isolated and or narcissistic were more likely to see others as less authentic. So perhaps like harboring a distrust of others in the world. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Also from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, we have John Sunby, a second-year student in the Clinical Psychology Master's Program.
Thank you, Dr. Helm, and welcome to my presentation. My name is John, and today I'll be talking to you about the intersection between death and awe. This doesn't seem to be going forward. Oh, here we go. So as many of you know, Ernest Becker postulated that dealing with our own mortality is one of the humankind's greatest psychological and philosophical burdens, and that we actually engage in a lot of defenses when we're reminded of death, because the overwhelming terror of being reminded of our own death would be too much to handle. And so terror management theory has documented a lot of these defenses. And today I'm going to be focusing on one called worldview defense. And this is the tendency that when we're reminded of our own death, we tend to cling to our in-group and derogate out-groups. And this can lead to things like nationalism that can have really negative societal and individual effects. And so unsurprisingly, a lot of researchers have looked into what traits can modify these defenses. And they found that meditation and mindfulness are some of the ways that people's defenses are reduced when they're reminded of death. And so me and my fellow researchers decided to investigate whether awe could act in a similar capacity. And so just a brief overview, awe is a complex emotion that happens when we experience something that's really vast and that it can't easily be accommodated into our psyche. So for me, that happens a lot when I'm hiking in the mountains out here in Colorado, but for others, it could happen looking over a beautiful ocean or maybe even listening to a great piece of music. And so social psych has also researched awe extensively and have demonstrated numerous positive psychological benefits from awe. So people who experience awe tend to have more pro-social behavior, and they've also found that awe helps us focus on our collective and universal identities more than our individual identities. And some scholars have even speculated that awe can be the basis for a more tolerant and open philosophy that can deal with our own finitude without, having some of these defenses that we see in the terror management literature. So in this study, we decided to experimentally test this hypothesis, right? And look at the connection between death and the awe experience. And so we hypothesized that much like meditation and mindfulness, experiencing awe in the wake of a death reminder would reduce this worldview defensiveness that we typically see. And so for our study, we had 140 participants, 70 Republicans and 70 Democrats. And we first reminded them of death in the classic TMT fashion. So we had them either write an essay about their own death or 2 essay questions about their own death, or as a control or comparison condition, we had them write about a painful dental procedure. Then we distracted them for a little bit and then had them watch an awe-inducing video. So for our awe-inducing video, we picked one from a photographer from Yosemite National Park, and had a lot of drone shots and time lapses and was really gorgeous. And in comparison, we had the other group watch a hotel video tour, so very not awe-inducing. And then we measured their worldview defense after this. And so we did this by having them read either both essays from their political in-group, whether that was a Democrat or Republican, and their political out-group. And then we compared their scores on those 2 essays, and the difference we measured as worldview defense. And so as a reminder, for our hypothesis, we believed that participants who experienced a death reminder and watched our awe-inducing video of Yosemite National Park would exhibit less worldview defense than their peers who had a death reminder and just watched the hotel video or the control video. So unfortunately, our hypothesis was not significant, but we did have some interesting findings. So when we were looking at the average scores across the groups afterwards, we found that, while non-significant, the highest worldview defense scores were actually in the group that had both the death reminder and watched the awe-inducing video. So this was really surprising for us and ran counter to what we had originally predicted. So we decided to dive a little more into this. And we found that there's actually a big difference in how Democrats and Republicans reacted to awe in our experiment. So if you can look on the right here, Democrats tended to react to awe similarly how we predict, right? That there's slight decreases in their worldview defense scores, although it was a very small effect. But for Republicans, if you can look over here at the left, we see awe increasing worldview defense scores when people were reminded of death or not. And so we found this was really interesting. And we're still trying to figure out why this could be the case. Some of us think that it may just be a fluke, a type 1 error. It could also be kind of a 1-2 punch of a combination of death and awe could have been disorienting for some of the participants. And that this could have caused them to cling tighter to their worldviews. And finally, we think that in some Republican participants, it may have primed something more like religiosity. And so then they could defend their political orientation, which is often related. So anyway, I want to thank my co-authors, Dr. Joey Wagner and Dr. Tom Pazinski here at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And thank you all for listening and for the Ernest Becker Foundation for hosting this. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Next up, we have Dr. Emily Courtney. She's a social psychologist and assistant professor at the University of South Florida.
All right. Hello, folks. Thank you so much for being here today. So my current research focuses on the terror management health model. So taking all of Ernest Becker's tenets and approaches from a philosophical perspective applied to the domain of health. So I am looking at the way that women can view their risk of a deadly disease in breast cancer, and then translate that risk perception into how they feel about breast health, and whether those factors can work together in order to try and encourage women to take care of their breast health and reduce their own risk. As a very brief introduction to the terror management health model, we know that health threats are deadly, right? There are so many different things in our environment that can go wrong with our health and eventually kill us. When we're thinking about that consciously, oftentimes people are mostly mostly motivated to try and reduce their perceived vulnerability to whatever health threat that is. And that can be good. Sometimes we do the right thing for our health, but sometimes that can also be bad. On the other hand, though, there might be times where maybe our threat of death isn't so much in our focal conscious attention, but it's still somewhere in the depths of our mind. So when it comes to health, it's not so much about reducing vulnerability, so much as it is about making ourselves feel better about ourselves. When death is a little bit more insidious, we want to try and bolster our own feelings of self-esteem, which again, can be in some cases good, in some cases bad. But so that esteem bolstering factor is what I am most interested in, especially considering the idea of breast cancer as a very deadly health threat. What we know from the health-based research is that family history has a really strong impact on the way that women perceive their own risk, as well as their perceived lifetime risk of breast cancer generally. We know that increased susceptibility, my percent lifetime risk of breast cancer, is something that influences women's uptake of different breast health behaviors like breast self-exams, getting a mammogram, and sometimes undergoing prophylactic or preventative surgeries. Additionally, it is the case that family history may increase not only actual risk, women become more genetically at risk depending on their family history, but the breast cancer itself could be more deadly in that it's more a severe type of breast cancer and may as such make women view the disease as more deadly depending on their family history status. We also know that family history is important for intertwining health behaviors with feelings of esteem. People who have a history of heart disease in their families will be like, no, I don't smoke and I feel great about not smoking. We also see breast health as something of a lifestyle. Pink ribbons all over the place, Breast Cancer Awareness Month, some very important components that lead breast health to be very much in the public eye, something that we can draw a sense of meaning from. In terms of my first study, I was super interested in, all of this terror management health-based literature, and we don't really know just how deadly people think these different health issues are. So first, I asked a whole bunch of undergraduate students here at the University of South Florida how much they thought different diseases, ailments made them think about death or dying. And breast cancer was one of the diseases that people were like, yes, this absolutely makes me think about my own death. So that means that there's something else going on for people with a family history of breast cancer. So in 2 studies with a sample of 675 women over the age of 40 and therefore at very real risk of breast cancer, we did 2 different studies. We asked them about their demographics. What's your family history of breast cancer look like? How old are you? Socioeconomic status. Then we asked women to report what they thought their lifetime risk of breast cancer was on a scale of 0% to 100%, definitely going to get breast cancer. Then women were presented with the graphic you see on the right side of the screen here. So this is some information about what you can do to reduce your risk of breast cancer. Then women were asked how important they thought their breast health was to them. So this breast health esteem says, okay, taking care of my breast health is an important part of who I am. Taking care of my breast health affects how good I feel about myself. Then we looked at women's intentions to actually do the behaviors listed on this little infographic. How much are you going to, in the next 3 months, in the next year, in the next week, do a breast self-exam? Then we asked women again, okay, how much do you think of death when you think of breast cancer? And what we found were some really interesting effects. Across both studies, women who lost family members to breast cancer associated breast cancer with death to a much higher degree than women in the other two family history groups. So we've got women with no family history and women whose family members who were diagnosed with breast cancer survived their diagnoses. So like I said, I wanted to see if there was a combination of factors that led women to be most likely to want to engage in breast health behaviors. And what we found in these two studies using some serial mediation statistical analyses, basically just kind of a pathway through which we have this predictive model where we say, okay, women need to first understand their risk of breast cancer. I need to see my lifetime risk as high. Next, I also need to understand that breast cancer is deadly. I associate the disease with death. Next, it's important for women to understand or have this idea that breast health is important to them. Intertwine taking care of their breasts with breast health esteem. Lastly, we see all of those factors coming together to culminate in women intending to take care of their breasts in the future. And these results only came up for women with a family history of breast cancer and not for women who didn't have a family history. So in terms of takeaways, it's really important to consider that familial experiences are basically equivalent to risk perception, both in terms of susceptibility as well as the extent to which women associate breast cancer with death. Next, if we're trying to encourage behaviors, we need to make sure that women feel susceptible, but susceptibility, that lifetime risk, is simply not sufficient on its own. It needs to be intertwined with this idea of mortality. Lastly, and taking from the Terror Management Health Model, the health behaviors themselves need to be intertwined with a sense of meaning or esteem in order for those risk perception factors to come together in order to facilitate intentions in the future. So thank you so much. And if anyone is interested in seeing study materials, more of the data and analyses in an attempt to, make even more obvious the open science movement, please feel free to visit the link in this presentation. And thank you again to everyone for being here.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Courtney. That was very interesting. Finally, we have Alex Seeloff, a social psychology PhD student at the University of Arizona.
Peter? Right. So, hi everyone, my name is Alex Seeloff. I'm a fourth year PhD student here at the University of Arizona. And my research is at the intersection of existential psychology and the psychedelic sciences. And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the anxiety buffer reparation model, which is a terror management model of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So something a little bit different about this presentation is that my work right now, this is a theoretical model. I'm not going to be presenting data. So as we've discussed a tiny bit already, terror management theory says that the uniquely human awareness of death leads to a potentially debilitating terror, which leads to the need to manage that terror, which we do by our anxiety buffer, which consists of our cultural worldview beliefs, our self-esteem, and our close relationships. But what happens when our anxiety buffer is not enough? Well, research suggests that it leads to an increased risk of developing psychiatric symptoms, which we could reframe as dysfunctional methods of managing terror. So essentially what I'm saying is that psychedelic therapy is helping to repair people's anxiety buffer. And once that happens, the clinical symptoms can fall away of their own. But to understand the model and to understand how I came to even be researching that, I'm going to explain a little bit about how I got here. So when I was 27, I separated from the Air Force and I was living in Colorado at the time. And these two paths were emerging in my life. On the left here, I was studying at UCCS with Dr. Tom Pazinski. And as people have mentioned before, he's one of the co-founders of terror management theory. And then on the right here, I was also in my personal life, I decided to try marijuana for the first time. I was living in Colorado after all. But before I tried it, I wanted to learn about it. I was reading books, listening to podcasts, talking with friends. And two important things about psychedelics became evident really quickly. First is that they're being used to successfully treat a wide variety of mental health symptoms. And the second is that after taking psychedelics, people often report being less afraid of death. And this led to the intersection of those two interests. Once I entered grad school, I was able to start combining those interests and developing this model that I'm now telling you. And so to help understand this model, I'm going to describe top-down versus bottom-up methods of therapy. So I'm going to compare psychedelic therapy to talk therapy. So in talk therapy, a therapist talks with their client and helps them discover therapeutic insights, and ideally helps them integrate those insights into behavioral change in their life. But this is kind of a long, tedious process that usually takes months to years to show promising results. On the other hand, in bottom-up therapy and psychedelic therapy, it has a lot to do with the experience that people have during their psychedelic experience in therapy. This is something that researchers call mystical experience, and about 2/3 of people in these clinical trials experience them. And these mystical experiences are related to things like having spontaneous insights, experiencing intense emotions, having an all-encompassing sense of connection. And people rate these experiences as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives, up there with the birth of first children, death of parents, marriages, and the like. So then after people have these experiences in psychedelic therapy, they're then in the integration phase. And the integration phase is where the therapist is helping the client integrate what they already experienced during their dose day, during their psychedelic experience. They help integrate those insights into their lives. And the reason this is called bottom-up processing is that it stems from the client's experience themselves, their firsthand insights and experiences they had during dose day. And those sort of can bubble up then into behavioral change. This process flows a little bit more naturally, and people experience reduction in symptoms in days to weeks instead of years. And so as I mentioned on my last slide, there's one hallmark of mystical experiences is intense emotionality. And so we can think of emotions as sort of a feedback system. They don't just happen on their own, they're always connected to some sort of stimulus in an environment. And what psychedelic therapy seems to be doing is helping get people more in touch with those emotions. And so part of what I'm saying in this model is that emotions are sort of serving as a foundation for people to build their cultural worldviews and gain self-esteem from. So things that people feel strongly about, like literally feel strong emotions about, are things that they can then deepen their relationship with and become more competent at. And some of the most important ways that they can do this is by connecting to their biosocial, theological, natural, or creative modes of transcendence, which are just like different aspects of things that people can find meaningful and integrate into their worldview. As a summary, we need to manage our terror, and we typically do that by our anxiety buffer. But when it's mismanaged, we can develop these dysfunctional paramanagement methods, which can be broadly considered as psychiatric symptoms. And what I'm saying psychedelic therapy does is through people's mystical experiences on the day that they take the psychedelic, they get more in touch with their emotions, the things that are important to them. And ideally, through the whole process of psychedelic therapy, they're integrating those meaningful things into their lives and repairing their anxiety buffer. And once they do that, the symptoms should fall away of their own weight. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists. We will now open it up to the Q&A. Again, you can submit your questions using the YouTube live chat to the right of your screen. But we do have a first question. This is a question for Dylan. To your knowledge, has there been any work on how or if the various predictors in your study, so things like existential isolation, death anxiety, etc. So how or if these things are related to feelings of hurting or violence towards the self or others? Have you, yeah, I think you have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The first thing that comes to mind is levels of death-related thought. So the way that I've conceptualized death-related thought in this work was that the experiences that people have might threaten their sense of value, which can increase feelings of death thought or levels of death thought. But there's also work that approaches it from a bit of a different angle. One thing that the literature finds is that trans people report higher rates of suicide ideation and suicide attempts. And so just that suicide ideation might also be tied to death-related thought. And so one potential link that I see between, at least the predictors in this study, would be between death-related thought and risk for suicide as one way to make a connection between those variables.
This is a question for John. Is it possible the hotel video used in the control condition could have been a confound on the small chance for some reason that it happened to be awe-inducing for some people, and hence why the results weren't significant?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it was a nice hotel. I think my interpretation is that, you know, I wouldn't think people would find the hotel video awe-inducing. I think the bigger confound, in my opinion, is maybe they didn't find the video manipulation awe-inducing from Yosemite National Park. I mean, I certainly found it as a really beautiful video, but it's also, you're watching it on a screen and you're also in an online sample. So you could be looking at your phone during that time. You could be doing a lot of different things. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. If anyone's interested, I could definitely give them the different videos so they can make their own comparison. But yeah, I think it definitely is a possibility, but I wouldn't rule it's my first thing in my head. Thank you.
Makes sense. This is actually another question for you, John. What about if you showed Republicans a video of awesome guns? Maybe you would get a significant effect? Yeah, you know, awe, again, is something that is vast and hard to accommodate. So I'm sure big explosions in some way could do that. Yeah, it'd be interesting. I mean, I think that's maybe our follow-up studies is like, what types of awe connect with different people? And does it have, what types of awe produce more terror? And what types of awe could produce, you know, more beneficial effects in people? So yeah, it's a very interesting question. Cool. This is a question for Emily. Have you looked at how different age brackets have felt about these diseases or health concerns?
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that pilot data I presented with the whole different list of diseases, potential issues that could come up health-wise. Those were all done with an undergraduate student sample. So the average age there was about 19 and a half. And then the same exact pattern of results with that death association for breast cancer came up for women over the age of 40. So we did see replication with that specific pattern of data. However, I'm going to need probably a little bit more funding money to be able to ask larger age brackets how they feel about so many other different health issues. But excellent question. Thank you.
This is a question for Alex. It seems there is a correlation between significant psychiatric symptoms and a negative response to psychedelics. How does that play into your theory?
Okay, yeah. So there's a big difference between taking psychedelics in outside of a therapeutic container, as we could call it, versus taking them in a therapeutic container. So in the psychedelic trials where they're using them to treat these clinical symptoms, there's a lot of time and effort and support that goes into it, including about 8 hours before taking the psychedelic of meeting with the therapist and setting intentions and building trust and rapport with your therapist. During the therapy day itself, you're on in a very supportive setting with the guide sitting right next to you, helping you the whole time. It's very supported and structured. And then afterwards, the integration period is months long, and there's a lot of meetings there again. So it's a very different experience to take them with all that therapeutic support versus just trying to take it on your own to help mental health. So I would guess that sort of touches on an answer to your question, I hope.
Awesome. I actually have another. Oh, circling back to Dylan. Are you familiar with the minority stress model? And have you thought about how minority stressors might intersect with and impact existential concerns among trans people?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That is something I've thought about. Due to minority status, people have these varieties of issues that they might have that other folks don't, who don't have a minority status. And there is some work looking at how multiple, for instance, minority statuses might intersect. So not only being trans, but also maybe being a person of color. I think those might be interconnected and perhaps maybe lead to even heightened existential concerns. That's one way to maybe think about it. Another way is also that maybe in addition to these additional stressors, existential concerns are just another variety of stressors that these folks are experiencing. So I think maybe future work could maybe frame that together with minority stress model and this TMT related work. But yeah, I certainly think there's a place for thinking about these existential concerns as either being heightened with multiple stressors or being just another set of stressors that people experience. But really good question. Thank you.
Question for Marcus. Is there a direct link between terror management theory and supporting Manchester United? Draw your own conclusions. No, just kidding. There's a real question incoming. Sometimes more authentic / congruent people realize how they are more different from other people. So more profound aloneness seems to have some connections to the growth / self-awareness. How do you see that fitting in?
Could you repeat the question? I kind of
Yeah,
got
absolutely.
distracted by the menu swipe.
Yeah, for sure. So sometimes more authentic people, or people who feel more congruent with their values and themselves, they realize that they actually really are different from other people. So perhaps like this more profound aloneness, like this maybe existential isolation, seems to have some connections to growth and self-awareness. I don't know, how do you see those types of things like fitting in with your research?
I mean, yeah, I do agree with that. I think being more existentially isolated would, like, the findings kind of back that up, would make you view yourself as being more authentic. But I guess I was more surprised at the fact that you're more self-aware leads you to view others as less authentic, which is interesting. That kind of answer it.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. Perhaps it's something about not feeling like other people are satisfying your needs or something, and so they're less authentic or less able to be connected. There's another question for you here, Marcus. Do you think that existential isolation can predict dehumanization of others perhaps through its negative relationship with attributions of authenticity?
I certainly think so. I think we've had some findings in other studies where it's like people that are more existentially isolated tend to kind of like derogate others in a sense. But I don't know. That's like, they're kind of minor, but it's not full-on aggression, if that kind of makes sense. It's just kind of like feelings of distrust or suspicions of others, I guess. Or maybe it's kind of like you're not being, I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. I guess more research will help me find out.
That's an interesting perspective. Like a negative orientation, but maybe not motivating full-on dehumanization or violence. Interesting. This is a question for Katie. thinking about the morning/night person scale and being more open to emotions at night, some studies suggest that intelligence, or suggest an intelligence difference. I think between maybe morning doves or night owls, whatnot. I wonder if that is playing into your study somehow, like existential or IQ and existential angst, perhaps.
Yeah, that definitely could be a factor that plays into it. Because like another kind of possibility is like when people have more time or like better sleep, more cognitive ability, they might be aware of their own like isolation. So perhaps if they do have like higher intelligence scores, that they have that higher ability to like realize that, you know, we're alone in our own experiences in the world. So that would be interesting to definitely add to a future study. Thank you.
This is a question for Alex. Are there good preps for enabling and framing emotional connection prior to use of psychedelics that would make the work more beneficial?
Okay, yeah. So one of the things they do prior to dose day during the preparation phase is the therapist is familiarizing clients with kind of what to expect. And one of those things is emotionality, the fact that strong emotions can come up, along with instructions to essentially to not resist those when they come up, to lean into them. You know, they go into depth with this sort of thing, but as far as I'm aware, there's kind of those like general conversations. As far as like specific like interventions or something, I'm not familiar with like specific therapeutic practices. I'm a social psychologist, not a clinical. So that's like starting to get more in the weeds than I'm familiar with. But I do know that they do things to try to help prepare people for those sort of emotions to come up, and so that there's less resistance to it when they do happen.
That makes a lot of sense. This is a question for Peter. Can TMT and your research on the media help explain how polarized America has become?
That's a good question. I think it definitely can provide some form of an explanation, especially in regards to how people will choose to watch news that matches their worldviews. So an example was like COVID. That's kind of used by a lot of TMT researchers as like this overarching constant mortality salience, and people chose news media that was akin to their worldviews, leading to the kind of political polarized media climate we have now. So it definitely can provide an explanation, but I think there's still a ton of other factors that go into that whole polarization talk that still needs to be researched.
Makes a lot of sense. So this will be our final question. And this is actually a question for everybody. How has studying this TMT stuff impacted your own death anxiety? Does jumping in help, as Yalom or other existential philosophers would suggest? Or does it awaken some heavy stuff that has been comfortably repressed? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Courtney, who's in my first on my screen.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with that question, and thank you to the person who asked it. So I was very much drawn to TMT the moment I learned about it in an undergraduate research methods course with Dr. Ken Vale. So shout out Dr. Vale. It was one of those things where learning more about Becker's philosophy and perspective made so much sense to me and made the world around me make sense. And so in terms of trying to continue a vein of research in terror management, it's something that I found interesting from the get-go, something that made so much sense, gave the world a sense of meaning, but has definitely been one of those things that has helped me feel comfortable with life. You know, they say that in certain forms of meditation, meditating on death every now and then makes you that much more appreciative of the fact that you're not dead yet. So I think that for me, it's been helpful speaking only for myself. My family might say differently when I talk at the dinner table, but it's the way she goes.
I can certainly relate to all that. What about you, Katie?
Yeah, I joined the research lab like 2 years ago, so have been learning a lot about TMT throughout that time. And I think during that time, it has kind of what Dr. Courtney said, just like put a lot of meaning in my own life. And like, I think often about what are the things that buffer my own death anxiety, and like, I got to keep those things, hold them close, buffer that anxiety. I think I probably think about death a lot more than I would have if I didn't do TMT research, but I think I fear death a little bit less than if I hadn't done TMT research. But yeah, it has provided, I think, the research itself a lot of meaning to my life.
John, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, really interesting question. I think, like a lot of people, I was probably drawn to the field because I was thinking, in this vein already. Personally, when people tell me they're not afraid of death, my response is, have you really thought about it though? Yeah, and it's interesting. I think though I have gained maybe a better level of peace with it. Maybe that's just exposure therapy, just constantly thinking about it. But yeah, it's really interesting. And I think it is like a classic journey. So I'm sure my thoughts about my own mortality will change as I study this and throughout my lifetime. But yeah, thanks.
Peter.
Yeah, so like everyone's been saying, studying this has, it's made, I guess, death easier to think about, but it's still not enjoyable to ponder. Especially, I remember 2 years ago when I first started working with Dr. Harville Bowman here at JMU, and she provided me all these articles, and I started reading them, and I started putting pieces of my life together of why I tend to dislike some people and like other people. And it was really interesting to make my own and do these things. But in terms of thinking about death, I still don't like to do it, but I do it more willingly nowadays. So yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it can make you more comfortable with, I guess, dying, which, yeah, but.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, so I think as Jonathan mentioned, and maybe some others, I think there is like a selection bias in this. Like we were all supposedly more interested in it, and so like there's a predisposition there. So something I learned like in one clinical class that I took was that essentially like if a therapist is working with a client and if the client hasn't brought up any sort of existential issues, like don't bring it up with them. But if they've opened that kind of worms for themselves, then you can go into it. And that's kind of because, like if they haven't started asking those questions, like it could just get a whole lot messier, a whole lot quicker. So I don't think it's for everyone. But for people who are asking those questions, I think getting the knowledge can help. And I was definitely asking those questions. So when I came across it, it just made a whole lot of sense. It made a whole lot of things make a whole lot more sense than they did before. And that was helpful. And then it also made me realize that I'm like, so the things that I'm doing that are meaningful in my life, I'm a little bit more aware of like kind of this underlying function it's serving. So I feel like I'm a little bit more intentional about choosing what I do. And I think that lends more towards like a more sort of intrinsic approach to life, sort of more like autonomy for myself and everything. And as we learned today, those things are kind of like associated with better well-being and everything. And I experienced that, at least in my like own kind of personal experience of everything. So yeah, I do think it has helped me, but I don't think it's for everyone.
120% agree. Marcus.
I don't really think too seriously about death. Just kind of hanging out, enjoying the good things in life.
Fair enough. Dylan.
Yeah, I like this question. It's one that comes up a lot. And as I think many others have said, yeah, I think for me too, I've been drawn to these ideas, asking big picture questions of meaning and why do people do what they do. And I think reading Becker's work, working within a terror management theory perspective has allowed me to make sense of these questions and think about things in a different way. I don't know if it's helped me deal with my own anxiety about death. I don't want to die. But the perspective that it's offered me has made the things that I'm doing now seem more meaningful. I think also allow me to see the things that other people do around me as their own pursuits of meaning and value. And through that lens, maybe encouraging a bit more compassion and understanding for things that on the surface might not make sense, but allows me to see the purpose that people's behaviors are serving, and as a way, maybe better able to help them through times of need.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're all striving for self-esteem and investing in our worldviews, trying to buffer ourselves, make a meaningful life. In Becker's terms, we're all pursuing our immortality projects. And I think you're right. It opens up the realization that not just us, but everybody is doing such a thing and trying to make sense and meaning out of their lives, which I think provides a lot of room for compassion. So finally, we just wanted to open it up to see if any of you panelists had questions for each other before we close out.
I did have a couple, but I think they've already been answered.
Cool. I have one quick question for Dr. Courtney. If behavioral like health intentions is the kind of desired outcome of this process, does your model suggest that associating breast cancer with death is a critical component to these positive behaviors? Like we have to make that connection or else it kind of falls apart.
That is the tagline, 100%. In another paper, my advisor, Jamie Goldenberg, and I put out fairly recently, we argue for the necessity of integration with death for breast cancer, as well as a variety of other health issues. But, you know, the biggest thing is, in order for us to engage in the behaviors that have some sort of meaning, there also needs to be that associated severity and threat. And that's going to be, you know, from that same terror management perspective, the thing that instigates the motivation to bolster meaning derived from those health behaviors. So the argument kind of being, you know, the fact that we do our Save the Tatas pink ribbon sort of approach is great, really, but it also needs to focus on the fact that breast cancer does kill people. So making sure that there is that connection is what theoretically should be the most beneficial for sustained behavior change.
Awesome. That makes sense. See, terror management does have real implications for
yes,
the world.
Practical application.
Absolutely. Did anyone else have a question they wanted to pose?
I had one for Alex, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So recently, I mean, awe can kind of be related to mystical type experiences. Maybe it's like a lesser version of them, right? To a certain extent. And I guess, like, at least in my research, realizing that some people might react not how you would expect to awe experiences, right? That they might react to them in terror. I'm wondering, has there been any research on mystical type experiences and how people react to that? Could someone potentially have a negative reaction to a mystical type experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of touches on something that one of the question I was asked earlier by one of the attendees. I think if people aren't ready for it and they aren't expecting it, it can be a little overwhelming, for one thing. And depending on where it happens and how it sort of plays out, it could be a traumatic experience. So I had a disclaimer at the end of my slideshow that said, like, without the extra like therapeutic support and everything, like pre, post, and during, there's risk. And that has to do kind of with like that nature of it, of like having these kind of experiences. And psychedelics aren't the only thing that cause these experiences. They're pretty reliable at doing it, but there's plenty of other things that without proper support, it could go south and it could be a traumatic experience. So I kind of think of psychedelics as like non-specific amplifiers. It's kind of just a useful kind of way of thinking of it. So if a person has like a lot of anxiety, or if they've had like past traumatic experiences or something, and those kind of things are close to like conscious thought or accessibility, they could come up during a person's experience. And if they're just like out in the woods trying to have a good time, and then it goes that way, and they weren't ready for it, it could go south. So that's why I couldn't stress enough that like taking these in a safe, supportive container is important, and like being ready for it is really important.
Thank you.
There was a nice comment from the chat that kind of related to the discussion we were having a moment ago, that we're all on the journey from the cradle to the grave. And hopefully terror management theory can help our species learn to know itself better, and in doing so, reduce the suffering for all of us as we make this journey through life. I think it's a very nice sentiment. All right, well, thank you again to all of our panelists and to everyone who attended. Thank you for your time today. If you enjoyed this webinar, please consider supporting future webinars by making a donation at our website or linked in the description to this YouTube video below. If you're interested in keeping up to date with future webinars and news at the Foundation, make sure you're on our monthly email list, and you can sign up on our homepage. Thanks again.